What did the Romans really see when they looked across the fog-choked highlands and glimpsed figures screaming out of the mist naked, except for blades and streaks of brilliant blue across their skin tonight? We slip into that haze of confusion myth and second-hand reporting, where history gets blurry, skin gets painted, and some poor Roman foot soldier probably wrote home something like, "They were very blue. Please send help," unless, of course, you already know how to extract dye from a panicked snail, in which case, congratulations, you might just survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Maybe the ravens or the Romans will take notice. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step barefoot onto the wet heather. The air is damp, not rainy, just moist enough to blur the edges of the landscape. You hear distant shouting. Not chaos, not war. Just the wild echo of human defiance bouncing through the glens. You're in Caledonia, and you're probably being watched. A real historical source tells us that several Roman chroniclers, most famously Tacitus and later Herodian, described the native inhabitants of northern Britain, the Picts, or possibly earlier Britons, as blue-painted warriors. The name Picti itself is Latin for painted people, though it's unclear whether the name was given because of real practices or because the Romans liked labeling people based on their fashion choices. According to these sources, the warriors appeared nearly naked in battle, their skin covered in blue patterns or full-body pigment. To the highly armored, highly regimented Roman legions, this was terrifying. And more importantly, completely unfamiliar. A quirky twist. Some historians think the blue paint wasn't just about battle. It might have served ritual purposes, been linked to coming-of-age ceremonies, or even just looked really cool. After all, nothing says you can't colonize me like rolling up to the fight half-clothed and dyed like a moody blueberry. You bend down now, brushing aside a clump of heather. There, in the shallow mud, is a piece of old pottery. Nothing fancy, just a small shard stained with a bluish residue. Did it hold woad paste, snail goo, or just berries mashed in the wrong season? A scholarly debate rages on. Were these Picts tattooed permanently with blue, or was it temporary body paint? The evidence is frustratingly scant. There are no preserved Pictish skins, and the Romans weren't exactly reliable narrators. But we do have hints. Tiny, suggestive scraps of carvings, dye residues, and poetic references to skin marked by fierce brightness. You rise, and ahead, a figure breaks from the fog. They are barefoot. Their hair is braided in knots. Their chest and arms are striped in blue, like a moving map you don't know how to read. They don't speak. They just raise one hand, not in threat, but in invitation. And turn. You follow deeper into the blue-tinged world where identity is painted, not spoken. And the lines on the skin may tell you more than any Roman diary ever could. You follow the figure deeper into the mist, through bracken over boggy turf beneath twisted Scots pine that creak like old gossip. The blue on their back shimmers faintly in the damp. Not war paint, not decoration, something in between. Because tonight, we meet the likely culprit behind all this, a plant called woad. The kind of plant that ferments terribly, smells like betrayal, and leaves behind a shade of blue so memorable the Romans wrote angry letters about it. You kneel beside a patch of tall, weedy growth, pale yellow flowers, deep green leaves, and a smell that suggests it was once used to dye fabrics and scare away neighbors. This is Isatis tinctoria, woad. A real historical fact, woad has been used across Europe for centuries, millennia, even as a source of blue pigment. Its use dates back at least to the Neolithic, and it was cultivated heavily in the Iron Age. When processed properly, woad produces indigotin, the same blue chemical compound found in indigo dye, and it stains everything, including pride. The figure before you stops at a hollowed-out log filled with sludge. They dip a finger in and smear it down their cheek. You're invited to try. But maybe don't breathe in too deeply. Because here comes the quirky bit. The traditional method of processing woad involves fermenting the chopped leaves, sometimes in stale urine, sometimes in animal dung, always in a way that makes modern chemists wince. The resulting paste is pungent, persistent, and once applied to skin or cloth, transforms into a luminous blue that can last through battle rain and skeptical in-laws. You look down at your own hands, they are somehow already stained. You didn't notice. That's how woad works. You glance up. The figure gestures to their skin covered in swirling patterns lines that echo hill shapes, bird flight, the twist of riverbeds. A scholarly debate still simmers. Did the Picts really use woad on their skin the way Romans described? Some scholars argue that woad isn't particularly skin-friendly, potentially caustic or unreliable when applied to living flesh. Others point to archaeological finds and medieval recipes that suggest it could be made into skin-safe paste, with enough patience and enough fermented moss water, apparently. The figure steps forward, dips a narrow brush made from deer hair into the paste, and begins tracing a line up your arm. It doesn't sting. It doesn't feel like anything, really, but it leaves a mark that seems older than your skin. You sit there in silence as the shapes unfold. Spirals, knots, tiny birds. Not warlike, just intentional. The woad has a mind of its own, or maybe you're just getting a little high off the fumes. Either way, when the figure nods and stands, you follow again. Not because you know what comes next, but because your body now belongs to the story, and your skin finally speaks its own version of blue. The mist thickens, but now it smells different, richer somehow. Earthier. You walk beneath low trees covered in moss, their limbs hunched as if eavesdropping. The figure ahead leads you toward a circle of stones and stops beside a wide, shallow bowl carved from slate. Inside it, something pulses faintly. Not alive, not moving, but unmistakably slippery. Because tonight, we ask a question no one thought to phrase with dignity. Did the ancient Picts smear themselves with snail dye? And if so, how do you convince a mollusk to make art? You lean over the bowl. It's full of shells, not the usual kind. These are small, iridescent, and slightly crushed at one end, as if someone got a little too enthusiastic with pigment extraction. A real historical curiosity. Tyrian purple, The famous ancient dye of emperors and royalty was made from the secretions of sea snails in the murex family. These dyes were known in the Mediterranean world, and their production was labor-intensive, requiring thousands of snails for even a small amount of pigment. While Tyrian purple was well purple, certain snail secretions can oxidize into deep blue hues under the right conditions. No hard evidence confirms Picts used snail dye, but whispers of it swirl through the speculative margins of both science and legend. A quirky experimental note. In the 1990s, a group of experimental archaeologists attempted to extract blue pigment from native British mollusks. The result: a faint stain, a lot of muttered apologies to snails, and a tentative possibility that a mollusk-based pigment could have supplemented or even rivaled woad. The figure picks up a flat stone palette, smeared with deep blue. They dip a finger into it, then point at your arm next to the dried woad. They make a new mark. It shimmers, not like paint, more like memory pretending to be a bruise. You ask with your eyes, why both? They nod, as if to say, because blue isn't just a color, it's a language. And different dialects require different recipes. A scholarly debate still looms in the pigment community. Could ancient Britons have had access to snail-derived dyes? Some say no, too impractical. Others argue that trade routes and folk experimentation make it plausible. If even a few mollusks gave a color no plant could match, wouldn't someone somewhere have tried it on skin? You imagine the ritual. A sacred pool. A handful of crushed shells. A long wait for the goo to oxidize. A priest or warrior whispering thanks, or possibly apologies to the sea. You dip a fingertip into the blue. It's colder than woad. It smells faintly of salt. And when you raise your hand to your face, the pigment leaves a streak across your cheekbone, like a tide mark from a forgotten ceremony. The figure grins, not because you got it right, but because you're now part of the experiment. They hand you a pouch, woven grass shell, buttons, a hint of heather inside. You tuck it away. You'll need it later. Because the next question isn't how did they dye their skin, it's why. You step through a curtain of low-hanging rowan branches, each berry like a bead of red punctuation in a blue saturated paragraph. The mist opens into a clearing ringed with stones and shallow pits that once held fire. The figure before you begins to hum not a song, exactly more like a rhythm for the bones. It vibrates faintly in your chest. Because tonight we ask what might be the bluest question of all. Were the Picts painted or tattooed? Because that stain on your arm, it hasn't washed off yet, and it might never. A real historical debate has swirled for centuries around this question. Roman accounts such as those from Julius Caesar, Tacitus, and later Isidore of Seville all describe Britons or Picts as being dyed or painted blue. But the Latin words used picti vitrum stigmata can imply either paint or tattoo depending on context. And let's just say context was not the Romans' strong suit when it came to describing people they disliked. You kneel beside a large stone slab where carvings spiral out in loops, some clear, some softened by time. The figure beside you runs a hand over the stone, tracing the swirl. Then they reach into a pouch and remove a needle. Not sharp, not modern. Bone, maybe. Or fish spine, and beside it a lump of blue. Not woad this time, not snail. Charcoal and ash mixed with something sticky. Resin, maybe. Birch tar. A quirky experimental footnote. Some modern researchers have replicated ancient tattooing techniques using bone needles and natural dyes. When certain binders are added, woad can work as a tattoo pigment, but inconsistently. Some believe a more stable black was used for actual tattoos, while blue was layered on top as temporary decoration. The figure holds the needle out to you. You decline for now, but you watch as they tap the point gently into their forearm. Not deep, just enough to leave a mark. It's slow, deliberate. This isn't for show. This is memory in skin. A scholarly theory suggests that the Picts might have used both tattooing for identity, for tribe, for oath, paint for battle ceremony, or mood. Imagine a warrior walking into combat with arms tattooed in black, but freshly overpainted in shimmering blue, the symbols vibrating with intention. You glance down at your own arm. The paint glistens. The pigment from earlier has dried into your pores. And where the snail dye touched your skin, it's changed. Slightly iridescent now. Not fading. Settling. The figure hands you a stone with carvings on both sides. One a bird, one a spiral. They point to your hand, then to your heart, then to the carving, not as command, as invitation. You trace the spiral with your finger and feel for the briefest moment a flicker of heat, not pain, not pressure, just presence. This was never just about color. It was always about communication without speaking, marking the skin so that even silence had shape. You rise again, the needle stays behind, but the spiral that's coming with you. The air thickens with the smell of cold iron and damp moss. You step forward onto a low stone ridge where the earth is dark and the wind sharpens its teeth. Ahead, fires once burned warmer, louder times. But tonight, the blue lingers not in battle cries, but in stillness. Because tonight, we break down the chemistry of ancient blue. No magic, no metaphor, just fermented leaves, sticky tar, boiled snails, and whatever else could stain a human being in a way that said, I belong to the land and the land belongs to me. You kneel at a fire pit. Its ashes are long cold, but beside it sits a cracked pot glazed in what's left of a silvery blue residue. You run a finger along the inside and smell it. It's faint, but unmistakable woad's bitter bite, and something richer beneath. Sea salt, bone, ash. A real historical detail. Woad's blue comes from the compound indigote in the same molecule that gives indigo its deep hue. But unlike indigo, which comes from soaking the leaves in water and fermenting them anaerobically, woad requires an extra step, drying. Grinding, rehydrating, usually with something, biologically active, like fermented urine to create a paste. This paste, when exposed to air, oxidizes and turns blue. It stains anything porous, including you. You imagine a village preparing this paste, leaves rotting quietly in clay vats, children daring each other to touch it too early, a woman stirring the mixture with a carved bone ladle, whispering to it as though it might listen. A quirky note from pigment nerds. Woad dyeing smells terrible, like wet hay and regret. It's so notorious that during its peak in medieval Europe towns, that processed woad were often relocated outside city walls. One 14th century ordinance in Toulouse explicitly banned indoor woad fermentation due to unsettling vapors. You chuckle. Imagine being a Pict preparing for battle and offending your enemies before you even arrived. But back to your fire pit. Next to the blue-streaked pot is a flat stone with stains in 5 colors. You recognize the deep blue of oxidized woad and the darker shimmer of snail extract. But there are others paler pinkish, even green. They shimmer less, stain more. You pick one up and crush it gently in your palm, a green smear, made from copper oxide, crushed fern, burnt bone. A scholarly debate still simmers. Did the Picts use only woad, or did they experiment with a broader palette? Traces of ochre charcoal and even manganese oxide have been found in Iron Age burial sites. While blue gets the headlines, it may have been just one shade in a spectrum of earth-sourced fermented and ritually smeared cosmetics. You lift a thin piece of horn from the dirt. It's carved shallowly on one side, used perhaps as a palette or scraper. And suddenly you imagine it, the ritual of preparation. The grinding, the boiling, the waiting for blue to happen. Because blue doesn't appear instantly. It emerges, reluctantly, as if it needs to decide whether you're worthy. You look at your palm, the green fades, the blue stays, and the snail, it glints a little smugly. You place the pigments gently back on the stone. The figure returns. They nod not at your technique, but at your patience. Because dyeing the skin wasn't vanity. It was commitment. The moor opens slightly less forest now, more sweep of wind and heather, like the land is exhaling slowly after centuries of holding its breath. The figure walks ahead of you, blue marks glowing faintly beneath the fading light. Not like neon, like memory. Because tonight we ask not just what the color was, but what it meant. Why blue, in all its chill, bruised beauty, might have been the color of war, of worship, of identity itself for the Picts. A real historical note. In many ancient cultures, color carried deep spiritual and cultural significance. Blue, in particular, was often associated with protection wisdom and sacred boundaries. In Egypt, lapis lazuli decorated gods. In Mesopotamia, blue signaled heaven. In Celtic and Pictish cosmology, the records are less direct, but the residue remains. You pass a circle of standing stones. Each one bears a faint carving. Spirals, knotwork, zoomorphic creatures with open mouths and open eyes. One stone shows a figure, arms raised, body etched with lines that might be tattoos or just really committed paint. The figure beside you kneels before it and taps their chest. Then yours. You ask with your eyes what it means. They answer only by pointing to the sky, the blue above, the blue below, the blue between. A quirky anthropological footnote. In Celtic myth, blue was often linked to liminality, to the in-between places. Water fog, nightfall. Places where the rules shift. Wearing blue into battle might have signaled not just aggression, but a kind of transformation, becoming a vessel for something not quite human. Not possessed exactly, but activated. You crouch before another stone. It's cracked, weathered, half-sunk. But it shows a face. Not a god's. Not a hero's. Just a face. Quiet. Painted. No crown. No blade. Just spiral tattoos under each eye, like tears that never needed to fall. A scholarly theory argues that Pictish body markings may have been more than war paint. They could have been maps of identity, visual prayers, even magical contracts inked on the body to align with specific spirits, clans, or oaths. You reach for your own face. The blue mark from earlier is still there. It hasn't flaked. It hasn't faded. But it feels different now. Less cosmetic. More committed. Like it's finished waiting for you to believe in it. You stand. The wind shifts. The sky darkens a little, as if trying on deeper shades. And the figure ahead now walks with more purpose. You follow blue on your skin, weightless but certain. Not decoration. Not disguise. Declaration. You don't wear blue to hide. You wear it to belong to land, to story, to something too old to translate but too familiar to ignore. And the moors carry your steps like a song written in stone and skin. The terrain hardens now. Grass gives way to packed dirt, the kind trampled by feet that don't wander but march. You hear it distant, rhythmic. Not a drum. Not quite. Something older, like a heartbeat echoed through bone. Because tonight, you step into a Pictish war ritual. Not clashing swords, not cinematic glory, but pigment posture, silence, and the slow choreography of readiness. You approach a ring of figures, all quiet, all bare-chested. Their blue is fresh, smudged, and gleaming, not yet dried into battle. It streaks across shoulders, arms, cheeks, and stomachs. Some are marked in tight knotwork. Others wear sweeping spirals that wrap from shoulder to hip. You feel underdressed. A real, historical hypothesis. While there is no direct Pictish manual on pre-battle rituals, the ancient Celts were notoriously oral with their traditions, Roman accounts, and comparative anthropological research suggest that ritual painting was common among warrior societies. The act of applying pigment could be a form of spiritual preparation, protective magic, identity reinforcement, or psychological warfare. The figure from before stands to your right. They hold a small pot of pigment. Not woad this time. Something darker, richer. Almost black-blue. They nod at your arm. You extend it. The paste is cold. Their fingers are quick. They mark a spiral on your forearm. Then a line through it. Then they stop and place the pot down. The ritual is simple but precise. A quirky but plausible theory. Some researchers suggest that body painting was both symbolic and practical. The woad paste may have had antiseptic or insect-repelling properties, which would be handy in long conflicts or woodland ambushes. Others argue that the blue paint simply terrified enemies, especially well-armored Romans, who found themselves facing screaming warriors who looked like half demons, half maps. You watch as each figure steps forward to be painted one by one in silence. It's not vanity, it's uniform. There is no standard pattern, but each mark seems intentional, familial, spiritual, perhaps even prophetic. Some wear birds, some wear stars. One has an entire deer etched across his chest antlers, curling toward his collarbones. The paint isn't decoration. It's language. A scholarly curiosity. A few Roman sources mention chants or keening sounds that accompanied painted warriors. One suggests that the blue marks glowed faintly under certain lights. That's probably poetic license, but the psychological impact of walking into battle painted from scalp to shin is not lost on anyone. The figures begin to move, not marching, not yet. First circling, slowly, feet scraping in unison. It's rhythmic, yes, but it's also grounding, as if aligning each step with something older than strategy. You walk with them. No one stops you. Why would they? You're marked now. You belong. The wind kicks dust into the circle, and the pigment seems to wake under the breeze, clinging to skin like prophecy. The circle halts. No sound. Just the kind of pause that usually comes before thunder. But tonight it follows silence into mist. Because not every war is loud. Some begin in blue. The mist folds in like a curtain drawn by an unseen hand, wrapping the war circle in hush. You follow the painted figures into the hills, your feet silent on the moss-lined path. But even silence tells stories here, especially when filtered through centuries of confused Roman scribes. Because tonight, we flip the quill around and ask, what did the Romans actually say? And more importantly, what didn't they understand? A real historical source. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the late 1st century CE, described the tribes of northern Britain, probably early ancestors of the Picts, as all painting themselves with vitrum. The word vitrum has sparked confusion. It can mean woad. It can also mean glass, or even green-blue glaze. To a Roman eye, anything blue and unnatural-looking probably registered as vitrum, and not subtle socio-spiritual pigment choice. Another Roman Herodian described the Britons as wearing no clothes and staining their bodies blue to make themselves more terrifying in battle. Which sounds impressive until you realize Herodian never went to Britain. He likely copied someone else's version who copied from someone else who had a cousin, who maybe once saw a Briton from the safety of a moving chariot. You stop beside a moss-covered boulder, etched faintly with symbols, swirls an eye something that could be a bird or just a poorly drawn foot. The figure beside you points to it and shrugs. Interpretation was always a gamble. A quirky academic footnote. Some scholars suggest Roman descriptions of blue-painted Picts were strategic exaggerations. The more monstrous and barbaric the enemy appeared, the more justified Roman conquest seemed. Painted skin clearly savage. Unfamiliar languages and symbols, dangerous paganism. Blue buttocks. Absolute panic in the officer reports. You walk further. Past fallen trees. Past ancient stone walls no one remembers building. Past the crumbling edges of Roman roads now overgrown and sulking. And yet, despite Roman confusion, some details hold weight. The use of body paint or tattoo to signify tribal identity. The blue hue so distinct that it survived every round of translation. The Roman soldiers' palpable unease when facing warriors who looked like walking omens. A scholarly debate persists. Were the Roman descriptions of painted Picts based on first-hand encounters, or were they part of a larger imperial PR campaign? Recent analyses of burial sites and artifacts in northern Britain suggest the Picts were far from wild. They were organized, artistic, and deeply ritualistic. The blue wasn't chaos. It was coded. You reach a hilltop now. The wind howls. Below in the valley are distant figures, armored, square-formed, orderly. Roman. Long gone now, but still present in the bones of the land, in the scars beneath the peat. The figure beside you taps their arm, your arm, where the pigment still clings. Whose version will they write down, they seem to ask. You answer with a shrug. Then trace a new line across your chest. Blue deliberate, not for Rome, but for yourself. The marketplace begins to dim, not with sudden twilight, but with the kind of soft evening glow that makes linen flutter like moth wings and lets the scent of roasted fig drift unnoticed into your hair. You walk slower now. Your fox-stitched kerchief is tucked into your sleeve, its hem gently warmed by the crook of your wrist. Because tonight, we lean into something more subtle. Not fashion, not medicine, but something between performance and protection, the handkerchief as charm. Not the overt kind with bells and talismans, but the quieter charm, a blessing in cotton, a protection folded into embroidery, a superstition slipped silently into the seams. You pass an old woman sitting behind a row of cloth scraps. No signage, no price list. Just swatches each hand-stitched with strange symbols, triangles, antlers, spirals, little birds that look suspiciously like sideways lungs, protection against the vapors, she rasps, without being asked. Or heartbreak, hard to say which. You pick up a square dyed a deep sage green with one single red thread knotted in its corner. That one's for coughs, she says. The thread traps the air before it becomes a sorrow. You set it down gently and nod, a real historical theory. In many pre-modern European households, household textiles, including napkins, towels, and handkerchiefs, were believed to hold protective power if stitched with care. Some were blessed by clergy, Others were spoken over by midwives or herbalists before being given to children or travelers. Especially during outbreaks of plague or summer fever, a cloth near the face was as much ritual armor as it was hygiene. And what about the symbols? You recall the kerchief with the crescent moons, the one with a stitched goat, another with 7 dots arranged like the constellation Pleiades. Some believed certain shapes, especially those associated with natural rhythms, could mislead illness or fool it into passing you by. A quirky folkloric detail. In several rural regions of 16th century Scotland and parts of Brittany, people believed sneezing 3 times without a kerchief invited a spirit into the lungs. The solution? Carry a square of cloth with a knot in each corner to anchor the breath. You find one such cloth now tucked between baskets of lavender and fennel root. It's coarse, but the knots are perfect, each bound with thread soaked in beeswax and salt. You can't resist. You buy it just in case. And as you do, the merchant, a boy with clever eyes and blue ink on his thumb, whispers, "My gran says if you untie the knots before sleeping, the bad air lets itself out." Noted. A small girl tugs at your sleeve. Her kerchief is bright red, patterned with leaves. She grins. "Mine keeps me from turning into a goat." She says it with such conviction that you check your feet just in case. You round a corner now, deeper into the back of the market where the stalls thin out and the air thickens incense maybe, or roasted onion. An old man dozes beside a loom, his handkerchief folded precisely on his chest, embroidered with a spiral swallowing a sun. And you think maybe that's the secret. Maybe these weren't just accessories or tissues or signals. Maybe they were maps of hope, folded and carried, stitched with all the prayers no one dared speak aloud. A whisper for health. A stitch for safe passage. A symbol for the unknown. You touch your fox kerchief again. The thread feels warmer than it should. Or maybe you're just tired. Or maybe it's working. You walk on, a breeze picks up, and in the corner of the marketplace, a woman sneezes, dainty, dramatic, practiced. She lifts a handkerchief to her lips, presses it softly, folds it away. No one says anything, but half the market nods approvingly, because sometimes even silence recognizes grace. The sun folds itself behind the tiled roofs, now turning window glass into rose gold mirrors and stretching shadows like silk across the cobbles. You wander down quieter streets beyond the main square, where candlelight flickers behind lace-curtained windows, and someone plays a lute in an upper room too slow for dancing, too soft to distract. And all the while your fox-stitched handkerchief sits warm and unbothered in your sleeve. As it should be, because tonight we slip from the public square into the quiet etiquette of private sneezes, drawing rooms, salons, and supper tables, where every gesture matters, and a mismanaged cough could undo an entire courtship. You step inside a tall arched doorway and find yourself in a modest parlor, 3 chairs, a low fire, and a woman in violet silk, carefully folding a kerchief into quarters along invisible creases. Her fingers move without looking, as if the routine has long since left the realm of thought. She sees you, nods once, and continues. A real etiquette rule from the 16th century. In many noble households, the handkerchief became a tool of silent language. One tap to the chin could signal disapproval. Pressed to the lips, hesitation. Laid on the lap, readiness to speak. Wafted briefly in the air, a subtle cue that a nearby odor or nearby person was no longer welcome. Some called it nose code. Others simply called it good breeding. The violet-clad woman gestures to the hearth. A young man sneezes once, gently, apologetically, then dabs his nose with a kerchief so laced and perfumed you suspect it cost more than his shoes. She raises a single eyebrow in approval. You sit, and realize your fox embroidery is slightly visible. Not exactly court fashion. You tuck it back quickly. No one laughs. A quirky historical fashion note. By the late Renaissance, handkerchiefs had grown elaborate enough to serve not just as hygiene tools, but as conversational accessories. Some were edged with gold thread. Others bore tiny love poems stitched in corners. In Venice, it became fashionable for lovers to exchange perfumed kerchiefs after only 2 meetings, a portable promise that could be folded, pressed, and if things soured dramatically, returned with tears. Your hostess pours tea scented with orange peel and mint. She offers you a square of linen from a carved box embroidered with lavender stems, crisp and cool to the touch. You hesitate. She nods. Take it. You do, and something about holding a stranger's cloth, stitched with care and ritual, makes the room feel smaller, gentler, as though it's been designed to catch stray breath and soften sharp words. A scholarly observation from textile historians' handkerchiefs were one of the few items that could be personalized without altering function. Unlike a cloak or a glove, which needed to fit a kerchief, could carry identity in every thread, initials sent, prayer, superstition, sorrow. It could be loaned, lost, found again. It could remember you even when your name faded. The tea is warm. The conversation drifts from gossip to poetry to quiet. And as you rise to leave, the violet woman smiles. You may keep it, she says. You glance at the lavender stem kerchief in your hand. But I already have. She waves a finger. Every traveler needs 2. One to use, one to give. You nod, and step back into the cobbled hush of evening with 2 pieces of cloth, 3 shades of meaning, and a growing awareness that sneezes are never just sneezes, not when they travel with symbols, scents, and the silent approval of polite society. Night arrives gently, like a cat curling at your feet, present before you realize, and entirely disinterested in your schedule. The Renaissance marketplace has gone quiet, now the stalls shuttered, the echo of footsteps hushed by wool cloaks and closed shutters. But even in this velvet, dark kerchiefs remain close, folded in sleeves, tucked into waistbands, nestled beneath pillows like pocket-sized shields. Because tonight, we step into the realm of sleep and sickness, where handkerchiefs take on new purpose, not as declarations of elegance, but as defenses in the long hours when breath grows shallow and superstition stretches its fingers. You pass a small house where a candle flickers in the window. Inside, a woman sits beside a child's bed, murmuring soft words. The child turns, sneezes. She presses a kerchief to his mouth, not hurriedly, but with ritual. And you realize this isn't just hygiene, it's protection, a real domestic tradition. During times of illness, especially during the outbreaks of sweating sickness plague or seasonal fevers, handkerchiefs were soaked in vinegar herbs or even urine, then dried and reused, thought to capture or neutralize airborne miasma. Rosemary and lavender were the most popular additions, both for their smell and their symbolic properties. In some homes, kerchiefs were hung beside beds, not used, but present like warding charms. You step back onto the lane and notice a small apothecary door ajar. Inside, bundles of herbs hang from the ceiling like upside-down prayers. A man with ink-stained fingers is wrapping squares of muslin into little envelopes. For breath, he says, unprompted. Stuff them with clove and mint and the lungs may rest easier. And a quirky belief in several regions held that certain kerchiefs could trap bad dreams if placed over the face while sleeping. Some even embroidered eye-shaped patterns into the cloth protective mimicry, like keeping a second face alert while the first was at rest. You try to picture it, a nobleman asleep in velvet sheets, face half covered by embroidered linen, dreaming of battles and banquets while a stitch-eyed kerchief guards his breath. It's strange and oddly comforting. Another folk saying overheard earlier near the dye stalls echoes now in your memory. Sneeze without cloth, and the spirit might slip out your teeth. You're starting to see how the thread unspools. In the Renaissance imagination, the handkerchief wasn't just a barrier, it was a bridge between the world of the healthy and the ill, the waking and the dreaming, the known and the very superstitiously avoided. You lean against a wall near a sleeping inn. From within, someone coughs softly, a pause, then a sneeze, then silence. A moment later, laughter. Someone says, "Wrong kerchief," and the room settles back into its rhythm. Even in the quietest hours, the cloth matters. A scholarly reflection. Despite their softness, handkerchiefs were among the most handled objects in a household. They bore the weight of habit, ritual, and care. And unlike medicines or relics, they belonged to everyone across class, age, and even belief. A universal human need to breathe safely, to carry comfort in the fold of fabric. The wind rises. You draw your fox-stitch kerchief from your sleeve and press it gently to your face, not for a sneeze, but for warmth. The night smells of rosemary and ash, and somewhere between the shutters and shadows, you swear you hear a child whisper, "Don't forget the knot in the corner, or the dreams might get in." You smile, tuck the kerchief back into its spot, and keep walking. Because if breath is life, and dreams need guarding, then let the linen do its work. You walk now beneath balconies hung with vines, past sleeping cats, and open windows where lace curtains flutter like tired ghosts. Somewhere bells ring the hour not crisply, but with the muffled tone of a town already deep in its own dreaming. The streets have exhaled. Only those with something soft in their hands, bread books or kerchiefs, still wander. Because tonight we leave the bedrooms and apothecaries behind to follow the evolution of kerchiefs into code gestures that replaced words, entire romances whispered across ballrooms and balconies with nothing but fabric and flair. You round a corner into a covered gallery lit by oil lamps, each flame nestled in amber glass. The shadows are gold-tinted, and beneath them, a small group gathers, laughing softly, fans in one hand, kerchiefs in the other. It's a salon, a meeting of minds, and of hands that know what to do when language would be too obvious. A real cultural flourish from the Renaissance onward. Handkerchiefs, like fans and gloves, became tools in the growing art of social signaling. A dropped kerchief could be an invitation. A slow dab at the lips might signal disinterest, tossing it deliberately at someone's feet. An insult, or depending on the timing, a promise. You find a seat along the edge of the colonnade. A man across the way folds his handkerchief into a tiny triangle, presses it to his heart, then tucks it into his sleeve. The woman beside him responds with a half-hidden smile and a gentle wave of her own cloth, barely more than a sigh of linen. A quirky, historical anecdote. In several courts of Europe, nobles trained in kerchief code could conduct entire flirtations without speaking a word. There were manuals, unofficial of course, that detailed the meanings. Left hand equals sincerity, right hand equals play. A flourish to the left meant meet me. A deliberate drop I already did. You imagine the tension at banquets. A handkerchief falls. A dozen heads turn. A servant retrieves it too late. The moment the message has passed, you look down at your own. The fox embroidery is too whimsical for intrigue, but perhaps it speaks of wit. Or, at the very least, clean hands and good instincts. Someone beside you sneezes not loudly, but with a distinct upward inflection. A performance, almost. She retrieves her handkerchief with such practiced grace that it feels like part of a dance. Across from her, a man presses his own to his mouth unnecessarily. The exchange is complete. You suspect they'll be married within the year. A scholarly musing, the role of the kerchief as a language was not limited to love. In some records, kerchiefs were used during negotiations, arguments, and trials. One flick of the wrist might silence a room. Another might declare submission or defiance. They were portable theatrical devices loaded with more drama than most poetry. You rise now, stepping out from the gallery and back into the street. The stars above are faint like powdered silver brushed across velvet. You wonder, if you were to wave your kerchief now to no one in particular, what would it mean that you've traveled? Listened, prepared yourself for sneeze symbol or secret message. Or maybe, just maybe, it would say nothing. Because not every gesture needs to be read. Some simply ask to be remembered. You fold the fox kerchief, tuck it into your pocket, and step softly onward, not in search of signs, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing you carry them already. By now, the streets have surrendered entirely to the hush of midnight. Oil lamps flicker in pools of amber on rain-washed stone. The breeze smells faintly of cloves, warm bread, and the last traces of lavender from someone's drying line. You pass a carved archway and feel it hum slightly as you go, like the city itself is breathing through stone. Because tonight, we drift into the borderlands between use and ritual, where handkerchiefs aren't just fashionable or functional, but folded into rites, ceremonies, even quiet acts of remembrance. You pause before a chapel, not grand, not gilded, but old, so old the stones themselves lean toward each other like gossiping grandfathers. Its heavy doors are closed, but a side window flickers with candlelight. You peer inside. A woman kneels before a modest altar, eyes closed, fingers moving steadily. In her lap, a square of cloth. She presses it once to her forehead, once to her lips, and once to her chest, then folds it and leaves it on the stone beside a bowl of wildflowers. She rises and disappears into the dark. You remain still. A real historical practice. In some regions of Renaissance Europe, handkerchiefs were incorporated into rituals of protection and offering, carried to funerals, folded into grave wrappings, placed beneath cribs, or carried on journeys. In certain folk traditions, mourners would write the names of the dead on linen squares, then burn them slowly to release grief into the air. You ease the chapel door open. Step inside. The scent is faint beeswax thyme, old stone. On the altar are more cloths, some embroidered, some plain, some stained with tears or herbs or thyme. They aren't displayed. They're left, as if someone couldn't speak what they needed to say, and so let fabric do the remembering. A quirky regional belief. In parts of the Swiss Alps and Eastern Europe, travelers would leave kerchiefs at crossroads or mountaintop shrines tied to trees pinned under stones, so their breath might be carried onward even if they didn't return. Breath as blessing. Fabric as farewell. You find a bench and sit, reach into your sleeve and withdraw the fox kerchief. The thread feels different here, like it's listening. You unfold it, smooth it. Then, without quite meaning to, you press it to your chest and close your eyes. You think not of sneezes or courtship, but of those you've left behind. Of those who still breathe and those who don't. Of moments when you wished for the right words, but found only cloth. A scholarly whisper from textile anthropology reminds us that cloth has always been a proxy for touch. In an age when distance, illness, and silence separated people, the handkerchief stepped in, held in hand, pressed to lips left behind like a softer version of a letter. The chapel remains still. You fold the fox back into its square and stand. You don't leave it on the altar. Not yet. Some kerchiefs are for carrying forward, for holding breath, or meaning or memory, not to give away, but to gather. You step back into the night. And as the bells toll, once low and distant, you realize this city is sleeping with its handkerchief under its pillow. Just in case. The streets are almost empty now. Only your footsteps echo in the space between buildings, softened by fog that's crept in from the river like a thief with good intentions. Your breath makes small clouds. You walk slower, not because you're lost, but because you know the end of the night is near. And tonight, as the city sleeps, we drift into the edge of metaphor, where the handkerchief becomes something more than a tool, more than a custom. It becomes quietly, firmly, a symbol of being human. You pass beneath a stone bridge. A cat watches you from a parapet. It doesn't blink. Beneath the arch is a mural, faded but still visible. A woman stands, one hand on her chest, the other holding out a small square of cloth to someone kneeling before her. The figure accepts it, eyes wide. The image is cracked. Time has tugged at its edges. But the message, perfectly intact, a real cultural archetype. In literature and painting, the handkerchief appears again and again. In Shakespeare's Othello, it is a token of love, of trust, and ultimately betrayal. In medieval chansons, the kerchief is a lady's favor tied to a knight's arm before battle, meant to bring him luck or remind him of home. In every case, it represents something we can hold when words fail. You reach a low plaza where old stone benches circle a fountain. There, someone has tied scraps of cloth to the wrought iron railing, blue, white, green. You approach and see initials stitched into some. On others, tiny prayers. One simply says, "Breathe freely." You sit. A quirky modern echo. Even today, in some parts of rural Italy, Spain, and Hungary, handkerchiefs are tied to trees or fences during festivals or personal rituals, requests for health, fertility, forgiveness. Often soaked in wine or lavender water, they're left to dry in the sun, bearing both fragrance and memory. You run your thumb over your fox embroidery. You think of the kerchiefs you've seen today, the stitched spiral in the chapel, the crimson one held by the laughing child, the violet square folded perfectly at a salon. Yours gifted, carried, occasionally crumpled, and you begin to understand something. The handkerchief has always been a contradiction. It is soft, yet it holds our strongest intentions. It is small, yet it carries grief, hope, politeness, and warning. It is ordinary, but imbued with the most intimate things we never say aloud. You press yours briefly to your cheek. Not because you need to, but because it feels like the right gesture at the right time. A scholarly note on textile anthropology suggests that handkerchiefs endure not because they're necessary, but because they're familiar. We return to them for the same reason we return to lullabies or handwritten letters. They belong to the quieter parts of ourselves. You rise and walk again, the city turning pale as dawn begins to whisper at the edge of its rooftops. Soon there will be baker's smoke, horse carts, children with small red noses and bold-colored kerchiefs tucked into collars. But for now, it is just you, the breath you carry, and a square of cloth you almost forgot was in your hand. The sky lifts slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the spell of the night. Pale light seeps in from the east, catching on the rooftops like silk drawn across slate. You're the only one still walking, or at least the only one visible. And tonight, at the very end of our wandering, we come to rest, not with a sneeze or a symbol, but with the quiet truth behind all these folded fabrics. The handkerchief was never just for sneezing. It was for remembering, for connecting, for carrying what couldn't be held in words. You reach the top of a low hill just beyond the city walls, where a stone bench waits beneath an oak tree. Moss curls over its edges like a gentle punctuation mark. You sit. Pull your kerchief from your sleeve. Unfold it slowly, carefully, like turning the final page of a very old book. You think of the stories sewn into it. Not literal ones, perhaps, but fingerprints of the day. The faintest smear of lavender. The crease where it rested in your palm. The warmth it held briefly from another's hand. A real, historical footnote. Some families kept ancestral handkerchiefs wrapped in bundles with love letters, baby teeth, or locks of hair, objects that, though fragile, held enormous emotional gravity. These were rarely used, but often opened during storms, illnesses, or long absences, as though touching the fabric might summon the person who once carried it. You fold the fox square again, this time into eighths. It fits easily in your palm. A quirky legend from southern France tells of a cloth carried by a bride during her wedding, embroidered by 3 generations of women. Not for crying, they insisted, but to hold back the rain. The day stayed dry, but afterward the cloth was hung in the window during every storm, and the family swore the lightning never came near. You smile at the idea. Perhaps this kerchief will protect something too. You tuck it gently into the inner pocket of your coat, no longer just a fashion piece or souvenir, but a small cotton-wrapped companion. You breathe in the morning, bread baking, stone warming, mist rising off the tiles like a memory unwrapping itself. The market will wake soon. New cloth will be stitched. Old cloth will be lost. But the thread between people that endures, always soft, always close. And somewhere in that quiet continuity, a fox-shaped stitch waits for the next hand. The city, like your body, begins to stretch into stillness. The last threads of night coil away beneath the rooftops, drawing dreams back into the folds of linen pillows and deep feather beds. Even the bells hesitate, as though their chime might startle something delicate. You walk slower now, slower than before, because there is no rush. The air is cool, but no longer cold, touched faintly by the promise of rosemary and clean linen. Somewhere a door creaks open. A cat pads down a step. A baker yawns. And still you walk. The kerchief tucked against your chest isn't heavy, but it feels known now. Soft with the weight of laughter, memory, and centuries of polite sneezes. It has caught not just breath, but meaning. Not just dust, but gesture. You pass beneath a hanging sheet, fresh dried, the smell of sun in its weave. And for a moment, it brushes your shoulder, a benediction of cloth. You smile, because you understand it now. The kerchief was never merely about illness or etiquette. It was a tender flag for everything quiet we carry. a square of trust, a foldable wish, a hand-sewn pause. And as the birds begin to sing not loudly but sweetly, you take one last deep breath and let your thoughts settle like pressed linen in a cedar drawer. Let your eyelids drift. Let the morning hold itself back just a little longer. Let the thread of this story wind down into silence.